Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, March 15, 1943. Mercy General Hospital, Surgical Ward. The orderly stood in the center of the 8-bed ward and wept. Not quietly, not discreetly, openly, with heaving sobs that shook her thin shoulders and dropped tears onto her starched white apron. 7 post-operative patients turned their faces to the walls. The 8th, an elderly man with an amputated leg, stared at the ceiling and moved his lips soundlessly, as though praying. Dr. Harrison Whitmore Caldwell stood in the doorway, hands tucked into the pockets of his white coat, smiling. Not maliciously, not triumphantly, just smiling. The way people smile when they know with absolute certainty that nothing will ever touch them. Not ever. Not for anything. Esther Lowell was 42 years old. 23 of those years had been spent in this hospital, first as a ward aide in maternity, then as an orderly in general medicine, the last 8 years in surgery. She mopped floors, emptied bedpans, changed linens, handed instruments when asked. Never late, never drunk, never disrespectful. She earned $18 a week. Raised her daughter alone. Her husband had died in a steel mill accident in 1928, 6 months before their daughter Cordelia was born in January 1929. The company settlement was a one-time payment of $300. A room in a boarding house on the south side, 12 by 14 feet for the 2 of them. Cordelia was 14 now, in 7th grade. Excellent student. Straight A's. Wanted to go to nursing school, maybe even medical school if they could find a way. The boarding house was owned by Mrs. Karolina Brzezinski, a Polish widow with arthritis in both hands who couldn't cook anymore, but still kept the place immaculate. 6 rooms, 6 tenants, a riveter from Homestead Works, a telephone operator, a widowed seamstress with 2 boys, a railroad clerk who coughed through the nights from exposure to coal dust, and the Lowells. They shared a bathroom on each floor, took turns with the kitchen. Esther's room cost $4 a week, more than she could afford, but Mrs. Brzezinski had known Esther's husband, had attended the funeral, and never raised the rent even when coal prices went up. The room had a single bed where mother and daughter slept head to toe until Cordelia turned 12. Then Esther bought a folding cot from the Salvation Army store for $3. The cot was set up each night by the window, folded each morning and stored under the bed. 1 dresser, 1 chair, 1 lamp. A hot plate Esther wasn't supposed to have, but Mrs. Brzezinski pretended not to see. That hot plate saved them. Heating soup, boiling potatoes, warming milk when Cordelia was small and couldn't sleep without warm milk. Doctor. Caldwell had arrived at the hospital 5 years earlier, in 1938. He was 47 then. Surgeon, board-certified, associate chief of surgery. Tall, lean, with long fingers and cold gray eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Lived in a stone house in Shadyside with a circular driveway. His wife served on the hospital's board of trustees. His son was at Johns Hopkins Medical School. From his first day, Caldwell had methodically degraded the lower-tier medical staff. Not everyone, only those who couldn't fight back. Orderlies, aides, cleaning women. He didn't target men. Rarely nurses, and only the young ones without family connections. The hospital had buzzed with whispers when Caldwell first arrived. He'd come from Philadelphia, General Hospital, prestigious position, well respected. But something had happened there, something nobody spoke about directly. One of the older nurses, Florence Kimball, had worked at Philadelphia General before the war and knew the truth. Caldwell had been asked to leave. Not fired. Physicians of his caliber were never fired, especially not surgeons with the right family connections. Simply asked to relocate. A young nurse had accused him of improper conduct. Nothing physical, just words. Humiliating, degrading words repeated over months until the girl had a breakdown and left nursing entirely. Her father was a shopkeeper, nobody important. The hospital administration had investigated quietly, found no witnesses willing to testify, closed the matter. But they'd made it clear to Caldwell that a transfer would be advisable. So he'd come to Pittsburgh, to Mercy General, where his wife's family had connections to the board, where his credentials were impeccable, where nobody knew about Philadelphia. He'd selected Esther immediately, perhaps because she was quiet, perhaps because she never met his eyes, perhaps simply because he could. It began small. Criticisms in front of patients. "Lowell, this floor is filthy. Have you gone blind?" The ward was spotless, mopped twice per shift, but Caldwell found imaginary dust beneath beds. Esther silently took the bucket and mopped again. The patients said nothing. Then came larger reprimands. "Lowell, you've mixed up the instruments again. Is your head full of sawdust?" During rounds, in front of the entire ward, the instruments were correctly arranged. Esther had checked 3 times, had stayed awake the night before the morning surgery. But Caldwell found what no one else could see: a microscopic scratch on a clamp, a barely visible spot on a tray. The other orderlies noticed but said nothing. What could they say? Caldwell was a surgeon. They were orderlies. He had a medical degree from Columbia. They had 8th grade educations. He lived in Shadyside. They lived in Southside boarding houses or Lawrenceville tenements. The social distance was unbridgeable. Even the nurses, who had some professional standing, avoided interfering. They'd seen what happened to those who challenged Caldwell, transferred to night shifts, given impossible patient loads, written up for minor infractions that suddenly became major disciplinary matters. The nursing superintendent, Miss Margaret Thornton, had gone to nursing school with Caldwell's wife. They played bridge together on Thursday evenings. Nobody wanted to end up on the wrong side of that friendship. After a year, Esther began stuttering in Caldwell's presence. After 2 years, she flinched when he entered a room. After 3, she stopped eating in the cafeteria, brought bread from home, ate in the supply closet to avoid his gaze. She never told Cordelia anything. Came home silent, lay on the narrow bed facing the wall. Cordelia did her homework by lamplight with a scarf draped over the shade so the light wouldn't bother her mother. She'd ask, quote, _2__. Esther would answer, quote, _3___. But Cordelia noticed other things. How her mother's hands trembled when she ironed her uniform on Sunday nights. How she'd stand at the window some evenings, staring at nothing, her face blank and her eyes wet. How she'd wake in the night and sit on the edge of the cot, breathing hard, as if she'd been running. Cordelia would pretend to be asleep, watching through half-closed eyes as her mother rocked back and forth in the darkness, arms wrapped around herself, lips moving in wordless prayer or protest. And then that Thursday morning, March 15th, 1943, during morning rounds, Caldwell decided the game had gone on long enough. Esther was assisting with a dressing change, patient with gangrene of the foot, 3 days post-amputation. The patient was a machinist from the Westinghouse plant in East Pittsburgh, 48 years old, diabetic, had ignored the infection in his foot until it was too late. His name was Walter Kowalski. He had a wife and 4 children, the youngest only 6. He'd been crying quietly in the night, mourning his foot, worrying about his job, about how he'd work the machines with only 1 foot, how he'd support his family. Esther had sat with him twice during her shift, holding his hand, saying nothing because there was nothing to say, just being present while he cried. Caldwell unwrapped the bandages. Esther stood beside him with the tray. The quiet of the treatment room, the smell of iodine and damp gauze. Kowalski stared at the ceiling, his face gray and slack. Caldwell examined the stump, turned to Esther. "Lowell, you're an idiot." Esther froze. Caldwell continued in an even, almost gentle voice. "You brought non-sterile materials. 3rd time this week. Are you deliberately trying to harm these patients?" The materials were sterile. Esther had collected them from the autoclave room herself an hour earlier, had personally checked the indicators. The blue strips on the packages had all changed color properly, showing correct sterilization temperature and time. She'd signed the log, noted the batch numbers, followed protocol exactly as she'd been trained. But Caldwell was looking at her and smiling, and she understood that it didn't matter whether the materials were sterile or not. What mattered was only that he had said it. Quote 6. Quote 7. Walter Kowalski turned his head slightly, looked at Esther with something like pity in his eyes, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. What could he say? He was a patient, a man with one foot, nobody important. Esther saw his look, understood he wanted to defend her but couldn't, and that understanding was somehow worse than Caldwell's words. Esther left the treatment room, made it to the supply closet, sat on a stool by the window, and cried. Quietly, into her fist, so no one in the corridor would hear. Cried for 5 minutes, then wiped her face with a towel, went back to the corridor. 3 orderlies and 2 nurses stood there, faces stone, eyes on the floor. No one spoke. Only one orderly, an older woman named Ruth Kowalczyk, whispered, quote 8. But Esther didn't go home. She had bills to pay. The rent was due in 4 days. She owed Mrs. Brzezinski for last month. Cordelia needed new shoes. The soles on her current pair were worn through and Pittsburgh winters were cold. Losing even 1 day's pay meant Cordelia would go another month in shoes with cardboard stuffed in the bottoms to cover the holes. So Esther returned to the ward. 4 beds needed fresh linens. Walked in and saw Caldwell. He stood by the window dictating orders to a young nurse. Saw Esther, paused. Quote 9. She approached. The nurse looked at her notepad. 7 patients watched Caldwell. The 8th bed was empty. Patient discharged that morning. A successful appendectomy. A rare good outcome in a ward where most patients came in critical. Quote 10 Esther extended her hands. Caldwell took her by the wrists, lifted her hands to the light. His grip was cold, clinical, like examining a specimen. The touch made her skin crawl, but she stood motionless, barely breathing. Quote 11 Her nails were clean. Esther trimmed them every Saturday night with her mother's old scissors, washed her hands 20 times per shift with carbolic soap until her skin was red and raw. But Caldwell held her wrists and looked into her eyes. And in his eyes there was neither anger nor contempt, only the calm certainty of a man who knows no one will stop him. You're a disgrace to this ward. You're a disgrace to this profession. I'm astonished you haven't been fired yet. He released her hands. Esther stood in the center of the ward, arms hanging limp, and something inside her broke completely. Not yesterday, not a year ago, right now, this moment. She felt the tightness in her throat, felt her eyes filling with tears and couldn't stop. Began crying in full voice, the way children cry when they have no strength left to endure. Great heaving sobs that shook her whole body, tears streaming down her face, dripping onto her apron. The sound echoed off the ward's white walls. Caldwell watched her for 30 seconds, then turned to the nurse. Continue rounds. Left the ward. The nurse followed, notepad clutched to her chest, walking quickly as if afraid to be left behind. Esther stood and wept. The patients were silent. One man, the elderly amputee in the corner bed, closed his eyes and moved his lips soundlessly, praying or simply hiding from what was happening. Another patient, a young soldier recovering from shrapnel wounds to his abdomen, stared at the wall with tears in his own eyes. He'd seen men break in combat, had broken himself when the shell hit his position outside Anzio. He recognized that sound, the sound of a human being reaching the absolute limit of endurance. Ruth Kowalczyk finally entered the ward, helped Esther to a chair, brought her water. Said nothing, just sat with her until the crying subsided. Then walked her to the staff room, helped her collect her coat, her purse, her worn leather gloves. Put her on the streetcar home, pressing $1 into her hand for the fare and for supper, knowing Esther wouldn't take it but forcing it into her pocket anyway. Esther came home at 3 p.m. Cordelia wasn't back from school yet. She had extra chemistry lessons on Thursdays, stayed until 4:30. The chemistry teacher, Miss Abernathy, saw potential in Cordelia, gave her advanced problems, lent her textbooks, talked about scholarships to Carnegie Tech or even to women's colleges in the East. Esther knew Miss Abernathy meant well, but couldn't let herself hope. Scholarships were for rich girls, girls with connections, girls whose fathers were doctors or lawyers or businessmen. Not for girls who lived in boarding houses and wore hand-me-down dresses. Esther undressed, lay on the bed, turned to the wall. Lay there until 6 in the evening. At 6, Cordelia returned, satchel heavy with books, cheeks red from cold, smell of snow on her coat. Pittsburgh in March was unpredictable. Cold one day, warm the next. Always wet. Entered the room, saw her mother on the bed. __quote _14__. Esther didn't answer. Cordelia came closer, sat on the edge of the bed, put her hand on her mother's shoulder, felt her mother flinch at the touch. __quote _15__. Esther slowly turned over. Face swollen, eyes red and puffy, hair coming loose from its pins. Cordelia froze. In 14 years, she'd never seen her mother like this. Tired, yes. Sad, often. But not this. Not broken, not defeated, not looking like she'd lost every last shred of strength. __quote _16__. And then Esther cried again. Without restraint, aloud, as she had cried in the ward. Cordelia held her, pulled her close, and Esther spoke through tears, spoke everything that had accumulated over 5 years. About Caldwell, about the humiliations, about how he looked at her, how he spoke, how he found non-existent errors. About the criticisms in front of patients, the impossible standards, the way other staff avoided her because association with Caldwell's target meant becoming a target yourself. About this morning, about the sterile materials he'd called contaminated, about her hands he'd called dirty, about crying in front of patients and him simply walking away. She spoke for an hour. Cordelia listened silently. 14 years old, 7th grade, straight-A student, track team member, first place in the district biology fair. Thin, fair-haired, with gray eyes and a narrow chin. A quiet girl who never got into fights, never talked back to teachers, never was rude to the other boarders. Sat holding her mother and listened. And inside, something was changing. Not quickly, not instantly, slowly, like ice changing to spring water. Cold, clear fury that doesn't scream or throw dishes. That simply records information and stores it for later. She asked questions. Calm, specific questions. How long had this been happening? 5 years. Had her mother complained? To whom would she complain? Did anyone witness these incidents? Everyone witnessed them, but no one would speak up. Had Caldwell done this to others? Yes, but not as severely, not as systematically. Why had he chosen her mother? Cordelia asked this last question very quietly, and Esther had no answer except, quote 17. That night, after her mother fell asleep, Cordelia lay awake thinking. Not about revenge, she was 14. Revenge was for storybooks and radio dramas. She thought about injustice, about power and powerlessness, about how some people could hurt others simply because nobody stopped them, about how the world was arranged so that orderlies apologized to doctors, but doctors never apologized to orderlies, about how her mother had worked at that hospital for 23 years, had never been late, never been drunk, never been disrespectful, and still a man could destroy her in 5 minutes because he felt like it. And she thought, someday I'll be the one with power. Someday I'll be the one people can't hurt. And when that day comes, I'll remember this. Esther calmed down by 7 in the evening, washed her face, boiled potatoes. They ate dinner together at the small table by the window. Then Cordelia did homework while Esther sewed, mending her apron, preparing it for tomorrow's shift. She'd go back. Of course she'd go back. What choice did she have? At 9, they went to bed. Esther fell asleep immediately, exhausted from the day. Cordelia lay with open eyes until 1 in the morning. The next day, Friday, Esther returned to work. Caldwell said nothing to her, didn't even acknowledge her presence. That was somehow worse than the abuse. As if she'd ceased to exist, as if she were furniture, as if 5 years of systematic degradation had finally accomplished its purpose: erasure. Ruth Kowalczyk stayed close, helped with tasks, ran interference when possible. The other orderlies maintained careful distance, afraid of contamination by association. Friday evening, Cordelia came home from school and asked, "Mama, which hospital do you work at?" "Mercy General. Why?" "Just curious. Is it always like this there?" "Not always. Sometimes." Cordelia nodded and went to do homework. On Saturday, she asked, "That doctor who yelled at you, has he been there long?" 5 years. "And he's been like this to you the whole time?" "Not just to me, to all the orderlies." "Have you complained to anyone?" Esther smiled tiredly. "Who would I complain to? The nursing superintendent went to school with him. His wife's on the board. Who's going to listen to me?" "What's his name?" Esther hesitated, looked at her daughter's face, calm, neutral, curious. Too calm, too neutral. Esther studied her daughter. 14 years old, still a child, but something in her eyes wasn't childlike anymore. Something hard and clear and dangerous. She thought about lying, about protecting her daughter from this anger, this knowledge. But she was too tired for lies. Caldwell, Dr. Harrison Caldwell. Cordelia nodded once, filed the name away in her memory where it would stay for the next 15 years. Said nothing more about it. Did her homework, helped with laundry, went to bed. But she didn't sleep. Lay in the dark thinking about a man named Harrison Caldwell, about power and injustice, about her mother crying in a surgical ward. On Sunday, they went to church, the Polish Catholic church 3 blocks away, where Esther had been attending since Cordelia was born. Father Kowalski gave a sermon about forgiveness, about turning the other cheek, about trusting in God's justice. Esther sat in the pew and tried to believe it. Cordelia sat beside her and thought, God's justice takes too long. Sometimes people need to help it along. After church, they walked home through the South Side streets. March wind, gray sky, smell of steel mills and coal smoke. Pittsburgh's eternal smell, the smell of industry and labor, of men breaking their bodies for $12 a week. Esther looked at the row houses, the corner stores, the women in headscarves carrying shopping bags. This was her world, the only world she'd ever known. Small, narrow, circumscribed by poverty and powerlessness. But Cordelia looked at the same streets and thought, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to be something. I'm going to have power. And when I do, nobody will ever make me cry in front of strangers. Monday, Esther went back to work. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The week passed. Caldwell ignored her completely now, as if she were invisible. Other staff began to relax, assuming the crisis had passed. Esther went through her days mechanically, mopping, changing linens, emptying bedpans. Came home exhausted, spoke little, went to bed early. Cordelia watched her mother fade, watched the light go out of her eyes, watched her become smaller and quieter and more absent. And made a decision. Not consciously, not deliberately. The decision made itself, rooted in the part of her brain that plans survival, that calculates futures, that refuses to accept defeat. I'm going to medical school. I'm going to become a doctor. And someday, somehow, I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. She didn't tell her mother, didn't tell anyone, just began working harder, stayed later at school, studied every spare moment, volunteered for every extra credit assignment. Miss Abernathy noticed the change, pulled her aside one day. Quote 32, quote 33, quote 34. Cordelia smiled politely, thought, I'll need more than a letter. I'll need scholarships, financial aid, work-study programs. I'll need to be better than good. I'll need to be perfect. And so, she became perfect. Not quickly, not overnight, but steadily, methodically, the way ice becomes glacier. First in her class, captain of the track team, president of the science club, won every academic competition she entered, took every advanced course available, studied late into the night by lamplight while her mother slept. Meanwhile, at Mercy General, Caldwell continued his reign. Esther became his invisible target, present but not acknowledged, functional but not respected. Other orderlies whispered about her with pity. Nurses avoided her. She became a ghost in her own workplace, erased by systematic degradation. In 1944, Cordelia graduated 8th grade as valedictorian, started high school at Alderdite, the best public school in Pittsburgh. Esther borrowed money from Mrs. Brzezinski to buy Cordelia a new dress for the graduation ceremony. Sat in the auditorium and cried when Cordelia gave her speech. Something about perseverance and the American dream and working hard. The audience applauded. Esther clapped until her palms hurt, proud and terrified in equal measure. That summer, Cordelia worked at the corner grocery store, stocking shelves for 35 cents an hour. Saved every penny. In September, started high school. Studied obsessively. Made no close friends. Didn't have time. Didn't see the point. Other girls talked about boys, about dances, about movies. Cordelia listened politely and returned to her textbooks. The war ended in 1945. Pittsburgh celebrated. Parades on Liberty Avenue, bells ringing from every church, people dancing in the streets. Cordelia was 16. Watched the celebrations from the window of the boarding house, thought about all the men who died so far away, wondered if any of it had mattered. Her mother stood beside her, silent. They didn't speak, just watched the city rejoice. In 1946, Cordelia took the entrance exams for Carnegie Tech, scored in the top percentile, applied for every scholarship available, waited. The letters arrived in April, acceptances from Carnegie Tech, University of Pittsburgh, Penn State. Carnegie Tech offered a partial scholarship, not enough to cover everything, but enough to make it possible if she worked, if Esther contributed what she could, if they survived on bread and potatoes for 4 years. Esther read the letter 3 times, looked at her daughter with wonder and grief. Wonder because her child had achieved something impossible. Grief because she understood what it meant. 4 more years of poverty, 4 more years of scraping and scrounging, 4 more years of Caldwell's abuse so her daughter could have a better life. I'm proud of you. I'm going to be a doctor, Mama. I'm going to be a surgeon. And I'm going to be so good that nobody can ever dismiss me the way they dismissed you. Esther heard the steel in her daughter's voice, recognized it because she'd never possessed it herself. Thought, my daughter is going to be stronger than I ever was, and I don't know if that's good or terrible. Cordelia started at Carnegie Tech in September 1946, pre-medical program. Took the streetcar from Southside every morning at 6, arrived on campus by 7, studied until the library closed at 10, took the streetcar home. Worked weekends at the grocery store, slept 5 hours a night, maintained a 4.0 average. Other students complained about the workload, about the difficulty of organic chemistry, about sleepless nights before exams. Cordelia said nothing, just studied harder. She was one of 3 women in her program. The male students ignored her or condescended to her, explaining concepts she'd already mastered, acting surprised when she scored higher on exams. Professors called on her less frequently, graded her papers more harshly, questioned her commitment to medicine, one professor told her. Cordelia smiled politely and kept studying. At home, Esther continued working at Mercy General. Caldwell had moved on to other targets, a young Irish orderly, a black cleaning woman who couldn't afford to quit. But the damage to Esther was permanent. She'd become silent, withdrawn, going through motions without life. Came home, cooked, cleaned, slept. Didn't attend church anymore, didn't visit neighbors. existed in a gray fog of exhaustion and defeat. Cordelia watched her mother fade and studied harder. In 1949, she applied to medical schools: University of Pittsburgh, Johns Hopkins, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia. Waited through spring. The rejection letters arrived in May, one after another, polite and devastating. __quote _40 __. Translation: We don't take women. We especially don't take poor women from South Pittsburgh boarding houses. Only one acceptance: University of Pittsburgh Medical School. Waitlisted initially, then accepted when 2 male students declined their spots. Full scholarship contingent on maintaining top grades. She started in September 1949. That summer, Esther Lowell collapsed at work. Acute exhaustion, the doctors said. Malnutrition, chronic anemia. She'd been eating less and less, giving her portions to Cordelia, saving every penny for tuition costs the scholarship didn't cover. Collapsed in the hospital corridor and died 2 hours later. Heart failure. She was 48 years old. Cordelia was 20. Sat through the funeral in shock. Father Kowalski gave the eulogy, spoke about suffering and endurance and God's mercy. Cordelia listened and thought, there is no mercy. There's only power and powerlessness. My mother had no power, so she died. I will never be powerless. Ruth Kowalczyk attended the funeral. So did a dozen other hospital workers, orderlies, cleaning women, a few nurses. They filed past the plain wooden casket, touched Esther's cold hands, wept quietly, whispered to Cordelia, "Your mother was a good woman, a very good woman." Dr. Harrison Caldwell did not attend. Cordelia noted his absence, stored it away with everything else: 5 years of humiliation, her mother's tears, the systematic degradation that had ground a gentle woman into gray dust. Stored it away and let it crystallize into purpose. Medical school began 2 weeks later. Cordelia moved into a women's boarding house near the campus, smaller room than the one on South Side, but closer, more convenient. The landlady was Mrs. Dorothy Keene, a former schoolteacher with strict rules. No men above the first floor, no cooking in rooms, no noise after 10 p.m. Rent due on the first of each month. 8 rooms, 8 women students, nursing, education, pharmacy, and Cordelia, the only medical student. The others were friendly at first, invited her to study groups, asked her to join them for dinners at the cafeteria. But Cordelia declined. She had no time for friendship, no energy for social connection. She studied alone, ate alone, existed in a bubble of concentrated purpose. Her room was 10 by 12 feet, a narrow bed, a desk, a chair, a lamp. One window overlooking an alley where delivery trucks rumbled past at dawn. She kept the room austere, no photographs, no decorations, nothing that might soften the edges or distract from purpose. On the desk, medical textbooks stacked neatly. On the wall, nothing. In the closet, 3 dresses, 2 skirts, 3 blouses, 1 coat. Everything functional, nothing frivolous. She'd pared her life down to essentials: study, work, sleep. Everything else was irrelevant. Threw herself into studies with something beyond dedication, beyond ambition. A kind of fury disguised as professionalism. Anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology. She memorized everything, understood everything, excelled at everything. Studied from 5 a.m. to midnight, broke only for classes and cadaver lab and the minimum food necessary to function. Other students complained about the workload, about exhaustion, about stress. Cordelia said nothing. Exhaustion was weakness. Stress was irrelevance. Only results mattered. In anatomy class, she was paired with 3 male students for cadaver dissection. They tried to exclude her at first, assigned her note-taking duties while they did the actual cutting. She tolerated this for 1 week. Then, during the second week session, she took the scalpel from the lead student's hand without asking permission, made a perfect incision exposing the brachial plexus, and said, Quote, 42. The men were stunned. The professor, Dr. Nathaniel Harding, watched from across the lab with a slight smile. After class, he pulled her aside. Cordelia looked at him with level gray eyes. That attitude earned her a reputation. Cold, arrogant, unfeminine. Other female students, there were 6 in her class of 120, avoided her. They'd formed a support network, met weekly to share notes and encouragement, helped each other navigate the hostile, male-dominated environment. They invited Cordelia once. She attended, listened to them discuss strategies for managing condescending professors and handsy lab partners, then said, "I don't have time for this. If a professor is condescending, I outperform him on exams. If a lab partner is inappropriate, I report him to administration. I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to become a surgeon." The other women exchanged glances, never invited her again. The male students still condescended. Professors still questioned. But Cordelia was beyond caring about their opinions. She had a mission now, a purpose forged from grief and rage and 15-year-old fury. She was going to be a surgeon. She was going to be excellent. And someday, somehow, she was going to ensure that what happened to her mother never happened to anyone else. Her first year, she ranked 3rd in the class. Second year, she ranked 2nd. Third year, 1st. Fourth year, she should have ranked 1st again, but Dr. Oliver Pemberton, who taught clinical medicine, had a stated policy. Women are capable students, but they lack the emotional fortitude required for medical leadership. Therefore, I cannot in good conscience award the highest grade to a female student. He gave her an A- on her clinical rotation despite performance he himself described as technically flawless. The grade dropped her to 2nd place. Cordelia filed a formal complaint with the dean. The dean was sympathetic but useless. "Miss Lowell, Dr. Pemberton has been teaching here for 30 years. His methods are unconventional, but they're within his academic freedom. I can't override his grading decisions." Cordelia walked out of the dean's office understanding something important. Formal complaints within corrupt systems accomplish nothing. Real power comes from building enough capital to destroy the system itself. She remembered that lesson, stored it away, would use it years later when filing her complaint against Caldwell, not within Mercy General's internal structure, but simultaneously to external regulatory bodies that had actual enforcement power. In her 2nd year, she chose surgery as her specialty. The decision was made during a clinical rotation in the operating room. She'd stood at the surgical table assisting a thoracic surgeon, Dr. Marcus Brennan, 60 years old, hands like iron, reputation for brilliance and bad temper. The patient had a collapsed lung from tuberculosis, needed a partial pneumonectomy. Complex procedure, 4 hours, intense focus. Cordelia held retractors, suctioned blood, handed instruments, watched every move. The precision, the control, the way Brennan's hands moved through tissue with absolute confidence. She understood immediately that this was what she wanted. Not the nurturing of pediatrics, not the endless talking of psychiatry. This. Surgery. The cutting away of disease, the reconstruction of damaged bodies, the clear binary of success or failure. After the surgery, Brennan pulled off his gloves, looked at her. "You didn't faint. You didn't tremble. You didn't look away during the difficult parts. Most medical students can't handle thoracic surgery. You have the stomach for it?" Cordelia met his eyes. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a long moment. Surgery's a hard field for women. Long hours, physical demands, institutional bias. You'll face obstacles male surgeons never encounter. Cordelia thought about her mother crying in the surgical ward, thought about Caldwell's cold smile, thought about 15 years of obstacles and endurance. Brennan nodded slowly. That rotation in her 3rd year cemented everything. Brennan was demanding, harsh, impossibly exacting. But he was fair. He criticized everyone equally, expected perfection from all his residents regardless of gender. If you made a mistake, he told you immediately and explicitly. If you did excellent work, he acknowledged it. Cordelia thrived under his teaching, learned to think like a surgeon, to anticipate complications, to move efficiently, to stay calm when everything was falling apart. By the end of the rotation, Brennan told her, quote, 56 other women students chose pediatrics or general practice, specialties considered, quote, _57_ for women. Cordelia chose the hardest, most male-dominated field, told her advisor she wanted to be a surgeon. He laughed, thought she was joking. When he realized she was serious, he tried to dissuade her. She was. In 1953, she graduated medical school second in her class. Would have been first, but the professor who taught clinical medicine had a policy of never giving women the highest grade. Applied to surgical residencies. Rejected by Johns Hopkins, Mass General, Mayo Clinic. Accepted by Mercy General Hospital in Pittsburgh. Full circle. Back to the place where her mother had died. She almost declined. The thought of working in that building, walking those corridors where her mother had mopped floors and emptied bedpans and cried in the supply closet, it was nearly unbearable. But then she thought, no, I'm going back there as a doctor. I'm going back there with power. And I'm going to find Dr. Harrison Caldwell. She accepted the position. Started residency in July 1953. 24 years old, Dr. Cordelia Lowell, surgical resident. Wore the white coat, carried the instruments, learned to cut and suture and close. Worked 100-hour weeks, slept in the residence quarters, lived on coffee and determination. And on her first day, she saw him. Dr. Harrison Caldwell, now 62 years old, chief of surgery. Still tall, still cold, still untouchable. He didn't recognize her. Why would he? He'd never noticed her mother. Certainly wouldn't remember a 14-year-old girl from 10 years ago. Cordelia introduced herself professionally, shook his hand, said nothing about her mother, smiled politely, and went to work. Over the next 5 years, she watched him, observed his behavior, documented his patterns, took mental notes. He still degraded lower-tier staff, not as openly as before. He'd learned some subtlety with age, but the essential cruelty remained. A word here, a look there, systematic erosion disguised as professional standards. Cordelia said nothing, did nothing, just worked, studied, learned surgery, became excellent. Chief resident by her 4th year, job offers from other hospitals by her 5th. She declined them all, stayed at Mercy General, waited. In 1958, she finished residency, applied for staff positions. Multiple hospitals wanted her. She'd built a reputation for technical excellence, steady hands, cool judgment under pressure. Chose to stay at Mercy General as an attending surgeon. Colleagues thought she lacked ambition. Cordelia thought, I'm exactly where I need to be. That year, she met Leonard Whitmore, mechanical engineer at Westinghouse, 15 years her senior, widowed, 1 grown son. Quiet man, stable, kind. Understood she was married to her work, didn't demand attention she couldn't give. They dated for 6 months, married in a simple ceremony at City Hall. No honeymoon, she had surgery scheduled. Leonard didn't mind. Bought a house in Point Breeze, modest but respectable. Cordelia moved her few possessions from the boarding house, set up a study for medical journals, continued working 80-hour weeks. In 1959, she became pregnant. Unplanned, unwanted. She'd taken precautions, but apparently not carefully enough. Considered abortion, but couldn't bring herself to do it. Worked through pregnancy, delivered in April 1960. A girl, Helen. Leonard was delighted. Cordelia felt nothing. Not love, not attachment, just exhaustion and resentment that her body had betrayed her ambitions. But slowly, over months, something changed. Holding Helen at 3 in the morning, nursing her, watching her sleep. The tiny fingers wrapped around Cordelia's thumb, the small, warm weight against her chest. Love arrived gradually, reluctantly, like spring after a long winter. By Helen's first birthday, Cordelia understood she would die for this child, would kill for this child. The understanding frightened her with its intensity. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Dr. Caldwell continued. He was 70 now, still chief of surgery, still wielding power. There were whispers about retirement, but his wife's influence on the board kept him in place. He'd slowed down, fewer surgeries, more administrative work, but the cruelty remained constant. Cordelia watched him humiliate a young orderly named Margaret Chen, a Chinese-American woman whose English wasn't perfect. Watched him reduce her to tears over improperly folded linens. Watched other staff turn away, say nothing, the same pattern that had destroyed her mother. And Cordelia thought, not yet, but soon. In 1961, she made attending physician. In 1962, associate chief of surgery. Youngest person ever promoted to that position at Mercy General, first woman to hold the title. Other surgeons resented her. Nurses respected her. She was demanding but fair, expected excellence but didn't humiliate, corrected mistakes without destroying dignity. And she began documenting. Every incident, every degrading comment, every humiliation inflicted on lower-tier staff. Not obviously. She didn't carry a notebook or make announcements. Just observed, remembered, recorded later. Built a file in her mind, then gradually on paper. Dates, times, witnesses, patterns. 5 years of documentation, meticulous and irrefutable. By 1963, she had everything she needed. A thick folder of incidents, witness statements from orderlies and aides who'd finally agreed to speak, anonymously, terrified but willing. Documentation of complaints to nursing supervisors that had been ignored, evidence of administrative protection. A case so solid it couldn't be dismissed. But she waited. Waited for the right moment, the right leverage, the right political climate. Waited until 1964, when Caldwell's main protector on the board, his wife, suffered a stroke and resigned her position. Waited until the new board chairman was Dr. Edward Morrison, a surgeon who'd trained at Mass General and had no patience for old boy networks. Waited until she had enough personal capital in the hospital to survive the fallout. Then, in February 1964, she filed a formal complaint with the Medical Ethics Board and the hospital administration. 15 years after her mother's death. 21 years after that day in the surgical ward when a 14-year-old girl had decided that someday, somehow, justice would be served. The complaint was comprehensive. 17 pages, single-spaced with appendices. Documented 73 separate incidents of staff degradation over a 5-year period. Named 32 witnesses. Cited specific hospital policies on professional conduct. Requested formal investigation and appropriate disciplinary action. The hospital administration tried to bury it. Too politically sensitive, too embarrassing, too likely to cause scandal. But Cordelia had copies, had sent them to the State Medical Board, to the Hospital Accreditation Agency, to the Nursing Association, had made it impossible to ignore. The investigation took 3 months. Witness interviews, record reviews, depositions. Caldwell denied everything, called the witnesses liars, called Cordelia vindictive, accused her of orchestrating a campaign to destroy him. His wife's allies on the board supported him. But new board members, younger physicians, couldn't ignore the evidence. In May 1964, the Ethics Board reached its conclusion. Found Harrison Whitmore Caldwell guilty of chronic unprofessional conduct towards subordinate staff. Recommended immediate termination and referral to the State Medical Board for license review. The Board of Trustees met to vote. 8 in favor of termination, 5 against, 2 abstentions. Caldwell was fired. 73 years old, 40 years of surgical practice, terminated for unprofessional conduct. The State Medical Board suspended his license pending further review. The suspension became permanent 6 months later. Florence Kimball, the nurse who'd known about Philadelphia, who'd watched Caldwell operate for 26 years, who'd seen what he did to Esther Lowell, attended the board meeting. Watched Caldwell leave the room. Watched him walk through the hospital corridors for the last time. Found Cordelia in the surgeon's lounge afterward. You did it. Yes. For your mother? Yes. Florence studied her. 35 years old, Associate Chief of Surgery, reputation for technical excellence and professional integrity. A woman who'd spent 15 years waiting for this exact moment. Underscore, underscore, quote underscore 66 underscore underscore. Cordelia didn't answer immediately. Thought about her mother crying in the surgical ward. Thought about 15 years of cold fury disguised as ambition. Thought about the systematic destruction of a man's career and reputation. Underscore, underscore, quote underscore 67 underscore underscore. But Florence saw the answer in her eyes. Empty victory. Justice served but satisfaction absent. Revenge completed but peace denied. She left Cordelia there, standing at the window overlooking the parking lot, watching Caldwell walk to his car. An old man, shoulders bent, moving slowly. Defeated. Broken. Exactly as he'd broken others. Cordelia watched until he drove away, then went back to work. Had a surgery scheduled at 2, patient with perforated ulcer, routine procedure. Scrubbed in, operated, closed, moved to the next case. Work was reliable. Work made sense. Work didn't demand emotional clarity. Days passed. Weeks. The hospital absorbed the scandal, adjusted to Caldwell's absence, moved forward. Staff whispered about Dr. Lowell's role in his downfall. Some admired her courage. Others thought her vengeful. Most just stayed quiet. Cordelia ignored the whispers, focused on work, went home to Leonard and Helen every evening. But at night, alone in the dark after Leonard fell asleep, she'd lie awake thinking. About her mother, about Caldwell, about 15 years of waiting and what it had cost. About whether justice and revenge were different, or just different words for the same thing. She had no answer. Perhaps there was no answer. Spring of 1969. Cordelia was 40 years old, chief of surgery at Mercy General Hospital. The previous chief had retired in January, recommended Cordelia as his successor despite opposition from older physicians who still couldn't accept a woman in charge. She'd accepted. Ran the department with firm but fair standards. Didn't humiliate junior staff. Didn't yell at nurses. Didn't look for scapegoats when things went wrong. Simply did her work and expected the same from others. Sometimes, making rounds through the surgical wards, she'd pause at the supply closet where her mother had cried. Stand there, remembering. The thin woman with work-roughened hands, the quiet voice that rarely rose above a whisper, the patient endurance that had looked like strength but was only fear. Her mother had been afraid her whole life, afraid of poverty, of unemployment, of making waves, of fighting back. That fear had killed her as surely as the heart failure. Cordelia had vowed never to be afraid, had kept that vow, had become everything her mother couldn't be, powerful, respected, untouchable. But in becoming untouchable, had she become like Caldwell? Hard, cold, calculating? She didn't humiliate staff, didn't abuse power, but she used power absolutely, strategically, without mercy when necessary. Was that better? Or just a different kind of cruelty? In April, a letter arrived. Plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper handwritten in shaky script. Quote underscore 68 underscore. Cordelia read the letter several times, set it on her desk, looked out the window at Pittsburgh's skyline. Steel mills still smoking in the distance, rivers converging downtown, bridges spanning water. The city her mother had never left, the city where she died at 48, exhausted and defeated. Thought. Dead. So it's finally over. But was it? Could it ever be over when the person you destroyed had died before you could… What? Apologize? Explain? Justify? She didn't know what she'd been waiting for. Some moment of reckoning, perhaps. Some confrontation where Caldwell would understand what he'd done, would see the connection between his cruelty to a 42-year-old orderly and his own destruction decades later. But he was dead now. The connection would never be made. The lesson would never be learned. The next day at 2 o'clock, she stood at the gates of Homewood Cemetery, watched a small procession, a plain casket, maybe a dozen people, no flowers, no ceremony. A poor funeral for a man who'd once lived in a stone house in Shadyside with a circular driveway. 5 years after losing his license, his savings exhausted by legal fees and his wife's medical bills, living in a rented room in Squirrel Hill, teaching biology to nursing students for $3 an hour. Cordelia followed at a distance, not approaching. Watched them lower the casket, throw dirt, speak brief words. His son was there. The Johns Hopkins graduate who'd become a psychiatrist in Philadelphia had severed contact with his father after the scandal. Stood at the graveside with a closed expression, neither grieving nor celebrating, just enduring. The handful of students and colleagues who'd known Caldwell in his final years, who'd thought him a harmless old man teaching basic biology, who'd never known about Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or 26 years of systematic cruelty. They dispersed. Cordelia waited until everyone left, then approached the grave. Looked at the fresh mound of earth, the temporary marker, quote, _69_. Stood silently for 3 minutes. Thought about speaking, some declaration of victory, some statement of satisfaction. But the words wouldn't come. What could she say? I destroyed you for what you did to my mother. True, but hollow. I spent 15 years waiting to punish you? True, but pathetic. I used power exactly as you used it, just more carefully, more legally? True, and horrifying. She turned away, walked across the cemetery to a different section, the less expensive plots where working people were buried. Section J, row 14, plot 27. Found her mother's grave. The headstone she'd purchased with her first paycheck from residency. Esther Lowell, 1901 to 1949. Beloved mother. Set down a vase of white carnations. The same flower she'd brought every April since 1950. 20 years of white carnations. 20 years of standing at this grave asking questions that had no answers. __quote _71__. Spoke quietly, almost whispering. The cemetery was empty, nobody to hear except birds and wind. But she spoke anyway, the words she'd been holding for 2 decades. You asked me to let it go, but I couldn't. I'm sorry. I did what I had to do. I don't know if it was right or wrong, but I couldn't do it any other way. You died because he broke you, because he took a gentle woman and ground her down until there was nothing left. I couldn't let that stand. I couldn't let him get away with it. So I waited. I planned. I documented everything. And I destroyed him exactly the way he destroyed you. Stopped. The wind rustled through the cemetery trees. Early spring wind carrying the smell of new grass and damp earth. But Mama, I don't feel anything. I thought I'd feel satisfied or vindicated or at peace. Instead, I just feel empty. He's dead and you're dead, and I'm here wondering what any of it meant. Did I serve justice, or did I just become another version of him? Did I protect others, or did I just satisfy my own need for revenge? I don't know. I don't think I'll ever know. Stood another 10 minutes, then walked away. Through the cemetery toward the exit, past rows of headstones and monuments. Past Caldwell's fresh grave without stopping, without looking back. What was the point? He was dead, she'd won, but victory felt like defeat. At the cemetery gates, she paused, turned around, looked at the cemetery, gray stones, bare trees beginning to bud, white clouds above. 2 dead people buried a few hundred yards apart, their lives intersecting in ways neither had predicted. Their deaths connected by a thread of cause and consequence spanning 26 years. And she thought, memory. That's what remains. Not justice, not revenge, not satisfaction. Just memory. The memory of a thin woman crying in a surgical ward. The memory of a 14-year-old girl deciding that someday, somehow, this would be answered. The memory of 15 years spent becoming strong enough to destroy a powerful man. The memory of empty victory. That's what I have. That's all I have. She turned, walked away, down the street toward the bus stop. Spring, April, warm, sunny. People walked past, shoppers with bags, workers heading home, children playing on stoops. Life continued. Always continued. Indifferent to justice, indifferent to revenge, indifferent to the small private wars people fought in hospitals and boarding houses and memories. Cordelia walked slowly, thinking about the past, the future, her daughter. Helen was 9 now, 3rd grade. A bright girl, cheerful, warm, nothing like her mother. Leonard said, quote 74 __. Cordelia thought, good, let her be nothing like me. Not cold, not patient, not vengeful. Let her be warm and immediate and incapable of nursing grudges for 15 years. Reached the bus stop, rode home. At home, Leonard and Helen were building a tower with blocks on the living room floor. Helen saw her mother, ran over. Quote 75 __. Cordelia lifted her daughter, kissed her forehead, felt the small, warm body, the trusting weight. Thought, this is the future, not revenge, not the past, not memory of humiliation. This, daughter, husband, home, work, ordinary life. Cordelia looked at her daughter, at her fair hair, gray eyes, trusting face. Thought, I'll tell you when you're older. I'll tell you everything. About Grandma, about Caldwell, about 15 years of waiting, about the complaint, about justice and revenge. I'll tell you so you'll know, so you'll remember, so you'll never let anyone humiliate you, and so you'll never humiliate anyone else. But aloud she said, Helen nodded seriously. Helen hugged her mother's neck, pressed close. I love you too, Mama. Cordelia held her daughter, stood that way for a long time, felt the warmth of the small body, heard the quiet breathing. Thought, this is what matters. Not revenge, not justice, not settling scores from the past. This, love, family, the future. This is what I'm protecting. This is what I'm building. Set her daughter down, went to the kitchen, began preparing dinner. Peeled potatoes, fried chicken, set the table. Ordinary evening tasks. Outside, darkness fell. Lights came on. Pittsburgh sank into spring night. Cordelia stood at the window, looked at the city lights. Thought about her mother, who lay in the cemetery under a granite headstone. About Caldwell, who lay there too, a few hundred yards away under a temporary marker. About herself, still alive, still working, still remembering. Still carrying the weight of 15 years' worth of calculated revenge disguised as justice. And she thought, was it worth it? Did I serve justice or just satisfy my own need for revenge? Did I protect others or just damage myself by nursing hatred for 15 years? I destroyed Caldwell's career, his reputation, his livelihood. I broke him exactly as he broke my mother. Was that justice? Or just more cruelty compounding the original cruelty? She didn't know. Perhaps there was no way to know. Perhaps revenge was always empty, even when it was called justice. Perhaps the only thing worse than letting injustice stand was spending 15 years becoming the kind of person who could methodically destroy another human being. But she'd done it. Couldn't undo it. Could only live with it, carry it, understand that she'd become something her mother wouldn't have recognized. Hard, cold, capable of patient destruction. Effective, yes. Powerful, yes. But at what cost to her own humanity? She stepped away from the window, sat at the table with her family. Leonard poured coffee. Helen chattered about school, about dolls, about friends. An ordinary family dinner. An ordinary life. The life her mother had wanted for her. Security, comfort, respect. A daughter who didn't have to empty bedpans or endure humiliation. Cordelia had built that life. But she'd built it on revenge. On 15 years of cold calculation. On the systematic destruction of a man who destroyed her mother. Did the end justify the means? Would her mother have approved? Or would she have been horrified by what her daughter had become? No answer. Only questions that would follow Cordelia for the rest of her life. She smiled at her daughter, answered questions, drank coffee, lived forward. Because life continued, always continued. Despite revenge, despite justice, despite memory of the past, life continued and demanded to be lived, day by day, moment by moment, choice by choice. And maybe that was enough. Maybe living well, raising a daughter with kindness, running a surgical department with fairness, treating others with the dignity Caldwell had denied her mother. Maybe that was the real justice. Not the destruction of Caldwell, not the complaint and the investigation and the termination. Just living well. Just being better. Just refusing to pass cruelty down through generations. She hoped so. Hoped her mother would have understood. Hoped that somewhere, in whatever came after death, Esther Lowell was at peace. Hoped that her daughter would never have to make the choices she'd made. Would never have to spend 15 years becoming hard enough to destroy an enemy. Outside, Pittsburgh settled into night. Steel mills glowing on the horizon, rivers black and silent, bridges lit with amber lights. The city where Esther had lived and died, where Cordelia had grown from a frightened child into a powerful woman, where Helen would grow into whatever the future demanded. 3 generations, 1 city, 1 small private war that had shaped all their lives. And now it was over. Caldwell dead, Esther long dead, only Cordelia left to remember, to carry the weight, to wonder if any of it had been worth it. She finished her coffee, cleared the table, helped Helen with homework. At 9 o'clock, put her daughter to bed, kissed her forehead, turned out the light. Leonard was already asleep. Cordelia lay beside him in the dark, listening to his breathing, thinking about the cemetery, the 2 graves, the lives intersecting in ways nobody could have predicted. And she thought, I did what I had to do. Right or wrong, I did it. And I'll live with it. That's all anyone can do. Make choices and live with them. Carry the weight and keep moving forward. Tomorrow she'd go back to work. Operate, teach residents, run the department. Do the job her mother had died to help her achieve. Do it well, do it fairly, do it with the respect for human dignity that Caldwell had lacked. That would be her real justice. Not the complaint, not the termination, not Caldwell's destroyed career. Just doing the work right, treating people right, being the kind of person her mother would have been proud of, not for the revenge, but despite it. She closed her eyes, slept, dreamed of nothing, or of things she wouldn't remember in the morning. And when morning came, she woke up and lived forward. Because that's what people do. They make choices, they live with consequences, they carry their histories, and they keep moving forward. Day by day, year by year, until they too lie in cemeteries under stones that say, beloved mother, or beloved wife, or just their names and dates, all their private wars reduced to 2 numbers and a dash. But while they live, they live. And Cordelia Lowell lived with purpose, with work, with family, with memory of her mother and knowledge of her own capacity for patient destruction. Lived with questions that had no answers. Lived with empty victory and complicated conscience. Lived forward despite it all. That was the story. That was the ending. Not triumph, not tragedy, just life, continuing as it always continues, indifferent to justice and revenge, and all the small private wars people fight in hospitals and boarding houses and memories. and maybe that was answer enough.